You can start.
We have about we have about 25 participants, so I think we should be good to start. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emmanuel Olet, Chief Water Development Officer at the African Development Bank, and I would like to welcome you to this Water Adaptation Community webinar. I will be the chair and panel facilitator throughout this webinar. And by way of introduction, I'm a civil engineer and have been a practitioner in the water sector for the last 20 years in Africa. And my practice has taken me across government, private sector, and multilateral development banks. The Water Adaptation Community is created to be a multi-stakeholder platform for knowledge and action to support the scaling up and acceleration of water adaptation. And one of the ways of doing it is through webinars such as this one. Now, by way of introducing the topic for this webinar is essentially putting water at the center of adaptation, an urgent need for a strategy for transformative change. This issue has been a subject of rich discussion and debate from a range of different practitioners, researchers, and experts in the recent past. And the water and adaptation community has invited some of them to this webinar. I'll just briefly introduce the 5 panelists, but then there will be longer introductions before they make their presentations. The first is Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, Principal Researcher at the International Water Management Institute, and she wrote in Nature in May 2022 on this topic. And she's a coordinating lead author of the water chapter of the 6th Assessment Report team of the IPCC. The second panelist is Dr. Shilpi Srivastava from the Institute for Development Studies. And together with others, she published in Nature Climate Change in February 2022. And the third is Henk Ovink, Special Envoy for International Water Affairs, Kingdom of the Netherlands, who is an international champion on this topic. The fourth is Dr. Faisal Rahman from Northumbria University in the UK, who has summarized key principles about water as a leverage and has made his discussion brief available on this platform. So we expect to not only have comments during this webinar, but also comments thereafter. And we have also invited Job Fahen, leader of the Water and Urban Program at the Global Center for Adaptation, to illustrate how water needs to become more visible in post-COVID strategies. Now, just to give the context to this webinar, we all know that climate variability and change are among us, and there has been a 5-fold increase of weather-related disasters over the last 50 years. By way of statistics, 9 out of 10 of those disasters are water-related. Now, with a warming Earth and a degrading biosphere, and as the weather intensifies, in dry areas, it causes more intense and frequent droughts, while in wet areas, it causes more extreme storms and flooding. At the same time, our societies are struggling with long-term development issues. Both challenges demand our urgent attention unless we want to face the consequences of inaction, which could be quite high. While mitigation, which is basically about reducing carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, is often understood, adaptation is less so. Adaptation has one of its greatest overlaps with water issues. It's linked to sustainable development goals, and it's linked to sustainable development issues such as water scarcity and risk reduction associated with more extreme events such as floods and droughts. But this fact is often lost in translation, I think, which has had their consequences for human society world over. The impact on the water cycle and our inability to adapting to it has got great costs. Just by way of mentioning, 2021 was a year of climate breakdown. I mean, we had 4 of the 10 costliest water-related disasters that took place in Asia, with floods and typhoons costing a combined $24 billion. An estimated 55 million people globally are directly affected by droughts annually, making it the most serious hazard in agro-pastoral areas that look at livestock and crops. Currently, in the Horn of Africa, as many as 13 million people are experiencing acute food and water shortages, and a projected 25 million will face similar fates by mid-2022. Drought is also costly for rich countries, and in 2021, drought directly cost the state of California agriculture sector an estimated $1.1 billion US and nearly 9,000 full and part-time jobs. So water investments are critical for adaptation across a range of sectors, but they're not happening at the scale and the speed which is needed. The sixth IPCC report lists 4 reasons for the centrality of water security in adapting to climate change. The first is that 50% of the world's population is subject to severe water scarcity for at least 1 month per year. The second is that climate change directly affects freshwater availability and affects water requirements for different sectors and uses such as irrigation. The third is that a large majority, which is about estimated at 60% of all adaptation responses since 2014, are about adapting to water-related hazards like droughts, floods, and rainfall variability. The fourth is that many mitigation measures can potentially impact water security. The IPCC report also acknowledges that efforts are fragmented and inadequate, and that for transformative change, the report stressed the need for joint action across climate, biodiversity, and socio-economic development interests. Such joint action could boost the investments and benefits of adaptation. Already such investments yield positive economic and environmental results and produce co-benefits of both adaptation and mitigation. Despite water's centrality, there is, for example, no adequate coordination to manage common water resources. This is coupled with lack of financial mechanisms to capture the true value and attract investments, but also given the current situation, it is urgent to find a strategy for transformative change. Now, what's the purpose of this webinar? This webinar aims to increase the understanding of how to put water at the center of adaptation, and many of our speakers will attest to this. It also aims at how to find a strategy to transform the current approach and increase investment. This webinar is also an input into the ongoing debate, which is also feeding into policy processes, such as COP27, which will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022, and the UN Water Conference in 2023 in New York. So that will be crucial for accelerating the water agenda. But we also hope that this webinar and this discussion will trigger the thinking with people working on this topic every day. And that means all practitioners and all who contribute to pushing this important agenda. We warmly welcome your inputs in the question and answer session, which will be ongoing as the panelists make their presentations. And also feel free to post your comments and we'll try to answer them as we go along. Just a perspective before I invite the panelists. I mean, just to share a brief experience from the African Development Bank, I think we really think that inadequate access, I think, to water services and water management remains a challenge. And we feel that this is being amplified by climate extremes, which is manifested in too little water, like in the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and in Southern Africa, but also too much water manifested in floods, especially in the coastal areas and in Central Africa, but also poor quality water, which amplifies economic water scarcity. And as the bank, we basically oversee knowledge and lending to accelerate efforts towards achieving SDG 6. Our current portfolio is estimated at about $5 billion with over 90 projects across Africa. And climate adaptation finance is in itself estimated at about 120 million of the bank's portfolio. And the bank is working with the Global Center for Adaptation to strengthen the preparation and access to climate finance. That was by way of introduction. I would now like to start off, I think, by way of introduction of the speakers. The first speaker will be Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, Principal Researcher, International Water Management Institute. She is coordinating lead author of the water chapter of the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. And like I pointed out earlier, she also wrote in Nature in May 2022 on the need for putting water at the heart of climate change solutions. She is the principal researcher with IMI, with expertise in climate change, groundwater institutions and policies, community management of water resources, political ecology, and the water energy food nexus. Welcome, Dr. Aditi, to make your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Emmanuel, and that was a fantastic introduction. Makes my job of presenting my slides much easier, because I think you have, through your introductory remarks, have captured pretty much most of the things I wanted to talk about today. Today's topic is around why water should be at the heart of climate change. For us in the water community, this has been obvious now for a long time, but it may not be equally obvious for those outside the water community. And I think now that the water and the climate change community work so closely together, this is a very timely webinar for basically understanding why water needs to be at the heart of climate change, not only adaptation, I would say, but also beyond adaptation, moving into mitigation. My first slide is from, and I have an IPCC background today because most of what I'm going to present are from the various IPCC reports. The first one, I think most of us realize, at least this audience realizes, we are already living in a climate change world. We are now living in a 1.1 degree warmer world than the pre-industrial times. So climate change is here and now. It's not that something we have to prepare for the future. It's happening, and we have all experienced climate change in one way or the other, irrespective of where we live on this planet. And obviously, some have experienced it more than the others, depending on their degree of vulnerability and exposure to hazards. Now, coming to the main reason, and this is also something that the water chapter does, and something, as I also mentioned in the nature viewpoint, is there are at least 4 reasons I think that water is quite central to climate change. First is that climate change, and that's increased temperature, for example, has affected all the components of the water cycle, be it precipitation, evapotranspiration, droughts, floods, groundwater, melting of cryosphere, glaciers. So all the aspects of water cycle have been affected. And obviously, because water is kind of central to all sectors of the economy of the society, so those impacts have been also felt across the various sectors. And again, some have felt those impacts more than the others. I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that while we are on the same boat, this boat is more leaky for some than it is for others because of the existing levels of vulnerability and historical reasons, including historical emission pathways and other factors such as colonial histories, etc. The third important reason why water is also very important is around adaptation. Water is at the heart of adaptation. Our IPCC report and others are showing that majority of the people, almost 60% of the documented adaptation that we are seeing is being around. People are adapting to water related hazards, mostly floods and droughts, and mostly in the agriculture sector, because agriculture is one of those really climate exposed sectors. And not only are they adapting to water, but they are adapting to water hazards, but many of the adaptation measures themselves are water related. Irrigation, soil moisture conservation, rainwater harvesting, wastewater reuse, you name it, a lot of those measures are also water. And finally, something I think we perhaps a little less recognized within the water sector is that water is also implicated in mitigation. Most mitigation, by that I mean reduction in emissions, but also more importantly, the latest report is almost talking about carbon dioxide removal, because that will be also very necessary to keep temperatures below a certain threshold. All of those are water implications. Now, I want to quickly go through some of these 4 points that I have made. First is what climate change has affected all the components of the water cycle. This is from the water chapter in working group 2, where we have done a global assessment across all the various components of the water cycle: mean precipitation, heavy precipitation, cryosphere change, runoff, stream flow, river flood, drought, etc. And you can see in majority of the locations, either the physical impacts have been negative and the societal impacts have also been negative of climate change. There are some small exceptions, of course, but overall, the evidence is overwhelming that climate change has affected water cycle, and those societal impacts are largely negative. Now, some reports from from the working group 1 report that is actually showing that even observed in the last 50 years, we have seen a rapid increase in observed change in heavy precipitation, and this has got high confidence in many of the regions of the world. This is a stylized world map with various regions being shown, and you can see that almost 19 regions have seen observed change in heavy precipitation in the last 50 years. Similar changes have also been seen in agricultural and ecological drought, but here the evidence is less certain. Part of it is also around observation stations and how long you have been doing those observations, etc. So part of it is certainly data related, but it's also entirely clear that agricultural and ecological droughts, there have been increases in that. So what does it mean for the future? Again, this is from the working group one summary for policymakers, but is showing that in the future, currently, if something, a 50-year extreme temperature over land event, if it's happening, say currently 5 times in 50 years, at a world that is 4-degree warmer, or let's assume 2-degree warmer, those kind of events would be happening more like 14 times in those 50 years. And I think the current heat wave that we are seeing in South Asia is also been, there has been, the climate change has made it much more likelier had there been no climate change. Similarly, we see similar projections for extreme precipitation over land as well as for drought. So I think the science is quite clear and unequivocal that climate change impacts are being felt through water related impacts. And as already mentioned by Emmanuel earlier, we also know that approximately half of the world's population are already facing water scarcity. Not all of it necessarily due to climate change, but due to a whole lot of other things like institutional and governance and access related issues. But climate change is simply exacerbating the existing experience of water scarcity. So that's first point around climate change is affecting water cycle. Now, how are people adapting? We are finding that majority of the adaptations are happening in response to water-related hazard. And that kind of makes sense because for a farmer, for instance, and that's, I mean, agriculture is the largest consumptive use of water. They experience climate change first and foremost through changes in the water cycle. So this was a work that we did as a part of the assessment, almost 2,000 papers, meta review. And that is kind of, we classify the different kind of hazards to which people were adapting, and droughts and extreme precipitation and floods come up as some of the important hazards. Then we also document that adaptation is happening pretty much everywhere. And most of these adaptations in the global south around agriculture, global north is around urban and floods, which also kind of makes intuitive sense. What is important, and I thought that a community like GCA and also all the banks should be perhaps working more into looking at what are these. We know adaptation is happening, but how effective are these adaptation in reducing risk? And our assessment wasn't able to actually say that adaptation is effective in reducing climate related risk. We concluded that adaptation has several benefits, but it's just not yet easy to establish that adaptation led to risk reduction. I think this is a huge knowledge gap that we have that needs investments in figuring out, and also in terms of actual implemented projects. There's better mechanism to understand what happens in terms of risk reduction. To quite contrary, sometimes actually instead of risk reduction, we also are finding maladaptive outcomes where risk is increased. Even more importantly, some of the assessment from our chapter shows that at higher levels of warming, we are already at 1.1 and we are almost certain to reach 1.5 in the coming decade. Majority of these adaptation measures, be it improved cultivars, changes in cropping pattern, water management, irrigation, all of these, the effectiveness of these in reducing risk actually declines substantially. I think this is also a very important area of investigation. Do we know adaptation is working now? And what do we know? How well would this adaptation work in a future warmer world? I think this is something we need to understand more about. And then finally, the fourth point of the presentation that I said is, and this is not very well, I think, engaged within the water community, we need to do more. And certainly mitigation community also needs to do more and work with water community, is that most mitigation as well as carbon dioxide removal. So CDR would become increasingly important because it's just, we aren't reducing emissions fast enough, and CDR would be needed, especially in the hard to abate sectors. So many of those have large trade-offs with water and food security. And our chapter concludes that many mitigation measures have considerably high water footprint, which must be managed in socially and politically acceptable ways to reduce water intensity of mitigation. In other words, water experts have to have a space on that mitigation table also. Mitigation is not only about carbon, but also about water impacts of that carbon emission. Some of the examples that comes top of our mind is afforestation and reforestation and their water and food impacts, bioenergy crops, etc. So with that, thank you so much, and back to you, Emmanuel. Happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aditi, I think for that excellent presentation, putting water in the center. And I think very many interesting questions are coming out, especially, I mean, your work that you've done on managed aquifer recharge, but also, I mean, practical examples on how to do this, I mean, to put water in the center of adaptation. I think we shall look at this, I think, when we start the open plenary discussion. The next presenter that we have this morning is Mr. Henk Ovink, Special Envoy for International Water Affairs, Kingdom of the Netherlands. And Mr. Henk will be presenting on water as leverage. Now, water as leverage, not to preempt his presentation, is a metaphor that has gained currency in both the climate and the water sectors to working together in an integrated manner for sustainable development and climate action. So as ambassador for water, Mr. Henk is responsible for advocating water awareness around the world, but focusing on building institutional capacity and coalitions among governments, multilateral organizations, the private sector, and non-government organizations. Mr. Ovink also teaches at Harvard, the London School of Economics, and University of Groningen, where he holds a research position on water governance. Henk, over to you to give us a brief on water as leverage. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel, for your kind introduction, and thanks all for the panel, but also thanks very much to the Global Center on Adaptation, Joep and Osse, and the whole team for making this work. I really look forward to our conversation. Water as leverage. We know water's importance, but still I start with the basics. We see the planet full of water. Over 70% of the world's surface is covered with water. Then again, water is scarce. If we take all the water from the surface, from the groundwater, from our aquifers and so forth, and you put it in a sphere, it's not a lot. And we saw and see still in the pandemic how that water scarcity, increased by climate change, and only increasing more, is impacting our health and our security across the world. At the same time, we see disasters happening every year. I can make slides of this every year. Last year, we saw floods and droughts, and we saw it again this year. So there's an urgent call for action. That call is amplified by IPCC reports from across the board that keep telling us that climate change is increasing. It's man-induced, man-made, and the impacts have to be mitigated. And the impact, we have to adapt to those impacts. And at the same time, of course, 1.5 degree is our best adaptation strategy. Now, at the heart of everything is water. Ban Ki-moon used to say water is life, and he couldn't be less true. But the climate change is impacting us through water most profoundly. 90% of all natural disasters are water related. And we feel it through floods and droughts that are impacting everyone more increasingly across the world, causing migration, but also economic challenges. And those economic challenges are most hardly felt in our cities, with billions of dollars at risk in the near future. But with floods, but with droughts, we see an impact on our GDP that is even longer lasting. So there's an economic side to that, but there's also a health and inequality issue, where the impacts of climate and water are actually increasing inequality and hampering health of the most vulnerable first. So there's an economic and a social aspect to that. And of course, also an environmental. Water scarcity, water pollution, increased by climate change, is undermining our biodiversity, our environment, and therefore also, again, impacting our health. So you have all these different aspects. You could say everything across our sustainable development goals that are connected through water and climate. And that means that we're not on the right track. Now we're moving towards more disasters. We're not preparing for that future. We're responding to the past. And that is also because our policies and our regulations, our framing, our validation and evaluation mechanisms are based on that past. And it means that the business case for the infrastructure of the past is actually the mainstream of everything we do today. And that is something we should reverse, and we can. We drafted Sustainable Development Goals as a holistic agenda that can help inform every decision we make now, but we don't. We cherry pick, we pick 1, 2, 14 or 16, and don't take this holistic view, while we know there is a Paris Agreement on top of that, and that there is an opportunity to not stay non-responsive and move from crisis to crisis, to not even react only to the crises that we face, and we have to, but that reaction, that response and the rebuilding becomes a proactive approach. A proactive approach that is really preparing us for the future. And with that, water is of critical importance. We call it water as leverage. It really is a catalyst for sustainable development and climate action. Why? Because water is connected to everything. Investing in water trickles down across every sustainable development goals. Investing in water really helps us mitigate and adapt to a better future. But for that, we have to become holistic, and we have to look at that long term, all those SDGs, and build a comprehensive approach feeding into short-term projects. And you need interventions on the short term, but they have to come from that understanding, understanding that complexity, valuing water across all sustainable development goals, and then start to intervene on the short term. Innovative, to catalyze, and then scale and replicate those innovations. For that, we have to be inclusive. We have to work with everybody across society, and of course, transparent and accountable, in our democracies, but also to build business cases that really help us change. And doing that, we will build capacity in our communities, capacity in our institutions, and in our partnerships. Now, we have to spur action, and for that, we need to be inspired. So design, planning, and innovation help, because we need the solutions, but we need solutions that are innovative, catalytic, while being pragmatic. We also need solutions that are across the board, connect, scale, time, and interest, connect across all those SDGs, and solutions that talk politics, that are really grounded in a political debate, from the ground up all the way to the multilateral levels. Aspirational and inspirational capacity that really helps us drive forward. Now for that, and then immediately go to a program I set up based on many experiences and examples from across the world. Our work in the Netherlands, the work with the Global Center on Adaptation, preparing for next year's UN conference, the work post-Hurricane Sandy in the US, an innovation challenge that really looked at water as a leverage for resilient cities in Asia. And we worked with an amazing group of partners, and of course the Global Center is there as one of the main. Based on an assessment, understanding comes first, of Asia's most profound vulnerabilities in the context of climate and water, we found over 30 hotspots where a lot of these challenges come together. Floods, droughts, subsidence, pollution, urbanization, inequality, etc. And based on the work we've done in the past, we said there is no such way as a project approach that builds cycle upon cycle in a very fragmented, siloed way, and doesn't address inclusion, neither a holistic approach. No, you have to come to a more, you could say, approach where we bring everybody together, where it's about people, their needs, their institutions, the capacity and the enabling environment. It's about innovation and R&D and the integration of needs, and it's a process that really brings everybody together to be able to develop those solutions that are catalytic, but there also can be funded. Bringing everybody together in the cities of Chennai in India, Khulna, Bangladesh, and Semarang, Indonesia, was first. Amazing images by Cynthia van Elk, who did the documentary photography and also a showcase now at the Global Center on Adaptation, how we brought everybody together. Really looking at the challenges of those 3 cities. We asked 6 teams to help us develop local coalitions with international partners, and come up with solutions that really matter. And I'll show you some examples before my time is up. And this is one from Chennai, where we assessed the current system, which is a scarcity system. You see on the left of the slide. There is enough rainfall, but it only falls in a very short amount of time. Chennai in the past used to capture the water in, natural ponds or man-made created. We're able to develop religious or closely connected to religious tanks to capture the water, bring it back to the aquifer. That's all gone. It's a hardened, rapidly growing city. So the water that falls, that is polluted and flows to the sea. The aquifer is overused or abused, diminishes, becomes more saline because of the salt intrusion from the sea. And that really makes that with the growing demand on water, and what is happening is that, with the rapid scale of desalination plants, more water, more fossil fuel powered water has to be pumped or trucked to the city, only increasing its carbon footprint. So you have a water scarce system that actually also increases climate change. Instead of that, it makes us less vulnerable. To reverse that, we have to look at that water cycle again, making sure that we green our cities, revitalize everything that we have, and bring that into the equation of building resiliency. And that is not something you do from the top down. That is where you have to start from the bottom up, and these are the connects. So that means that restoring historic tanks, building new ones, help restore forestry, renaturalize the rivers and canals, build bioswales on the community level, construct and reconstruct wetlands, and solid and liquid waste recycling for this business case while we adapt the buildings. Ticks flood prevention, drought prevention, helps increase sanitation and hygiene facilities, as well as water security, and improves the urban environment through nature-based solutions. And we started in four places to actually look at that local capacity. And with those interventions, we're not only talking about water, but here water really becomes a leverage to take all these sustainable development goals and build resilience in the community. We started at the school, on the playground, and the project is now in development. I wish I would have added the latest slides that just came in last week from the team, developing at this scale. And from this scale, we try to scale it up across not only Tamil Nadu, but actually India and then the world. I don't have time to look into the other proposals, but the idea is to focus on water in the context of the community level, build coalitions and innovations that can be catalytic, replicated and scaled, and have a rippling effect across the world to ensure that those aspects become are not only the alternative, but actually are mainstream actions to build resiliency across. My time is up, so I stop.
Thank you very much, Henk, for that concise, elaborate presentation on putting water as a leverage. I think we started off with water at the center of adaptation, then looking at water as a sector, but also water as an enabler, basically providing leverage across the water, food, energy, but like you pointed out in your examples, having ecosystems as well as part of this discussion in nature-based solutions. So some questions have come through, through the chat, which I think we shall handle during the general discussion. But right now, I would like to welcome the third presenter, the third panelist, who will now, moving from water at the center of adaptation to water as a leverage to making water visible in the post-COVID era. And I'm pleased to introduce Yop, who is the leader of the Water and Urban Program at the GCA, to illustrate how water needs to become more visible in post-COVID strategies. Henk has worked in the water and sanitation sector for the last 20 years with a particular interest in rural sanitation. He also served as the senior water and sanitation specialist in the water global practice at the World Bank in Washington and in New Delhi in India. And Yop has supervised a range of sanitation programs in South and Southeast Asia. So Yop, welcome to make your presentation. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
You can hear me now? Because I was muted, I noted. So thank you very much, Emmanuel. My presentation will be on leveraging water adaptation. So how do we get it done? It's also a presentation where I believe to show that things can be done. Looking at the numbers, looking at the climate predictions, someone might get pessimistic. This is not possible, not workable. One of the things I like to do is actually show that things can be done. Yeah, things can be done. Things need to be done. We need to be strategic. We need to be opportunistic. But most of all, we need to be practical, and it's important to move. We may not get everything right the first time. That's absolutely sure. But we need to move. Water, I mean, water underpins life. We've said it in a number of different ways. We heard it in a number of different ways already, supported by numbers. What I would like to add is to let's remember water is also a very cultural thing. It's a very emotional thing, and in the end, it's a very political thing. Allocating water means allocating welfare and well-being. And that's a political process. And of course, it needs to be supported by numbers. It needs to be supported by an improved understanding, what happens. But most of all, it's a very political process. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind when we start working on water. The second point I'd like to make from this slide is that even without adaptation, without climate change, there is a huge challenge in front of us in the water sector. The world is not on track to meet the SDGs on water. And climate change is not making it any easier. So whenever we work on water, we always be working on two issues. One is to plan for the future, build water systems for the future, for another world that we find ourselves in tomorrow. And at the same time, we need to make up for the deficits that we're facing already. Now, COVID, of course, I think one of the things that I take away from the COVID crisis, from the COVID pandemic, is a message of hope. Of course, things happened. It's not a positive story, but it also showed that a lot can be done when we face a crisis. And just to give you a small sample, the amount of money that got mobilized during the COVID crisis is immense. But we calculated between April 2020 and April 2021, the multilateral development banks committed over $250 billion to COVID responses. Of course, the EU committed itself to $750 billion for COVID recovery. Another 500 million was added. So it can be done. Money is moving, and there is a good opportunity for us as a water sector to make use of the COVID resources to build a slightly better future, maybe a greener and wetter future. What we did, we looked at the WHO recommendations. They came up with a set of recommendations of how the COVID crisis and climate change and health are linked. This is not meant to be read because they came with 10 guidelines, 10 principles, 10 recommendations. I don't want to go into the detail, but I actually want to show how behind each of these recommendations, there is water at the core. Water, though it's not mentioned in these recommendations, is an important part of making these recommendations work. So we looked at it and basically said, okay, what are the broad groups of recommendations? One is on prioritizing health. It's about build climate resilience. It's about a more healthy environment, and it's about improving the enabling environment. Now, if you look at the prioritization of health, it's about committing to a healthy recovery. It's about health is not negotiable. It's about harness health benefit from climate change, from climate action. a more climate resilient environment. It's about food systems, it's about cities, it's about a healthy, If you talk about the healthy environment, it's about energy systems that are actually not harming health. It's about protecting and restoring the nature as one of the most important things that we have. Enabling environment, and people mentioned it as well, that's what hangs it. It's about locally led action, and it's about making sure that the money to get things done is mobilized. Now, how is this linked to water? And I for each of these big buckets of actions, of recommendations, I've just taken one example how water is linked, and I've added an example of how at the moment within GCA, we actually trying to build in climate resilience and at the same time also address and improved and make sure that this has health benefits. So prioritize health, of course, I think it's important, like climate resilient drinking water source and sanitation services are absolutely essential for health. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm sure that everybody in this webinar knows this. For example, what the things that we do at the moment, we are working with the AFTB on the water supply and sanitation program in Uganda. It's the third phase of the project. It's a $60 million investment. And we try to make sure that the catchments where the water is being drawn from become more climate resilient. Become more climate resilient using green and gray solutions. So a combination, make sure that nature-based solutions are at the heart of the efforts of building climate resilient catchments. This is not just this will not just increase the climate resilience of the water supply, it also has important side benefits, such as creation of employment. It builds social resilience within the communities that are in the catchments, and it restores nature. Now, building climate resilience, of course, like there are multiple examples. Henk already alluded to one, water is leveraged, where there is a strong focus on building urban resilience. We're doing something similar in Chad, where we work with the World Bank. We're working on a more flood resilient city in Jamena. And I'll give you, this is the example. I'll focus a bit more on the next slide to give you a bit of a background on the challenges and the opportunities that are there. A healthy environment, for instance, think about patient energy systems. Aditi already mentioned sometimes working on carbon mitigation, climate mitigation has important impacts on the health and on food systems. You can think, for instance, the water being used for biofuels. One of the things that we do, the AFTB has a large project called Desert to Power in the Sahel. It spans multiple countries. It's really about harnessing the power and the potential of solar energy. And we try to make this energy systems climate resilient, because once it gets hotter, there are more parts you need to protect, for instance, your transmission lines against floods. You need to protect your solar panels against a hotter temperature, and so on and so on. And finally, the enabling environment. We work a lot, like local adaptation is absolutely crucial. But I also think it's important to realize that we cannot ask the communities to do everything. So what we need to focus on is make sure that the decisions and action are being taken at the lowest appropriate level. That's the principle of subsidiarity. We also need to mobilize climate finance, and there is a lot of money going around. I think we have to get better in harnessing that. One of the things that I like to give an example is that we work in Monrovia. We're really going to work with local communities to make sure that they drive the program. It's a World Bank finance program with a lot of action at the community level. We want to make sure that communities are not just telling what they need or just kind of participating in the design. They drive the action on the ground. They drive the action, for instance, in the Monrovia wetlands, to make sure that if the wetlands are protected, it doesn't go at their cost. And of course, like we mobilize also, for instance, GCF, the Green Climate Funding for water supply project in Freetown. A small example on how this works or how this looks like when you are on the ground. I recently returned from Chad. We worked with the World Bank, and actually what we did is we started defining defining design principles for the project. And what we came up with is like, we need to focus whenever possible on green and gray solutions, and we need to live with water. The World Bank is investing 150 million in Jamena. It's by far not enough to make the city flood-proof, if that will ever be possible. So we need to find ways of living with the water if it comes. We need to find ways of planning for the future. And it's not just about climate adaptation. Jamena is a very fast-growing city. It's going to densify, it's going to expand. We need to find ways of dealing with that and looking ahead in the future. We need to identify no-regret solutions, because we need to get going as well. And finally, if you want to work on floods, you need to take a systems approach. Just focusing on a small part of the city or one aspect of the city is not going to work. You really need to look at the whole city. That all sounds nice and simple, and I want to give you a small, share with you a small experience we had, because we of course thought, like, let's look at early warning. So we went and talked to the Meteorological Institute of Chad, and we found that they stopped collecting about half of the data they should about 15 years ago. And people manning the stations where they're recording the data on temperature, rainfall, have not been paid for the last 6 years. And as a result, the way that climate change will impact Chad is still very uncertain. And there's of course a question: do you want us to focus on what happens 20 years from now? Maybe or maybe not. Or would you like to, let's focus on what we do and what we can do right now, because looking in the future is hard, and we are borrowing that money. It's the government of Chad borrowing that money, and they need to think, how do we sell this do we borrow for now? Do we borrow for the future? It's always a political argument to be made. Other things we do, we look at how women are being more impacted by floods as compared to men. How can we narrow that gap? We try to prioritize investments, looking at the impacts of floods, not just on assets, but also on services and on people, and then prioritize on the basis of that, prioritize green solutions as much as possible that have the maximum impact and benefits for people in the city. And we will develop a strategy to involve local communities in the project once it gets down to the community level. Finally, what do we conclude, or what are our takeaways from looking at how we use the COVID money through health to focus more on, to get more money into the water sector for climate adaptation? It's definitely an opportunity. And we clearly think, and I think that climate and development related impacts on health are fundamentally underpinned by water. Again, it's the message that I think also Henk and Aditi brought out. Water is really important. We need to scale, we need to accelerate climate adaptation and work on the SDGs, and it's doable. I think that's really important. It can be done. It's also something that Henk brought out. Water-based planning requires a cross-sectoral response and financing. We cannot remain in our water silos. And I think one of the things that I've taken away of what I concluded after working in the water sector for the last 25 years, we need to get far better in reaching out and not say they're not coming to us. We need to reach out and be a little less focus less on ourselves and more on what's around us. what kind of recommendations on how to move forward? I think it's important to continue making the argument that health risks fundamentally are linked to water, and that water adaptation and water development, investing in water is investing in health. We need to look far more at the landscape model, at a landscape approach, and develop innovative implementation and finance measures that focus on entire landscapes rather than just a part of it. Just focus on a whole city. We need to focus and do much more on water-based planning, including water allocation across basins and urban catchment. But we need to realize this is a political process. We can, of course, support it by better understanding, better data, better predictions, but in the end, this is really a political decision and a political process. Because as I said in the beginning, allocating water is allocating welfare and well-being, and that's about politics. And I think finally, we need to also realize that more resilient water has huge positive impacts on, for instance, creation of jobs, on the well-being of the most vulnerable, on our economy. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I'm looking very much forward to the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joop, for that elaborate presentation. I think that now, basically that has highlighted a number of issues on accelerating adaptation, but not only that, but basically putting water at the very heart of adaptation, because it's key for addressing health risks. It's key to addressing, problems that are being encountered, water-based problems that are being encountered in the cities. So we are now moving on to a general panel discussion, and I think the audience has actually been sending in questions, and I think we shall be able to address them, I think, shortly in this panel discussion. So in this panel, I want us to go deeper into some of the issues that have been raised, I think, and get further discussion. So joining us in this panel are the previous speakers and presenters, Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, the Principal Researcher IMI, Mr. Henk, the Special Envoy for International Water Affairs, Netherlands, Mr. Joop, who has just made a presentation now. They will be joined in this panel by two other panelists, Dr. Shilpi Srivastava, who is a research fellow with the Resource Politics and Environment Change Cluster, the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. Shilpi has over 10 years of research experience in the field of water policy processes, access, regulation, and rights to water. And in her research, she uses the lens of water and climate to understand issues of power and patterns of authority, to explore spaces of justice, rights, and accountability. She completed her PhD in development studies at the University of Sussex, and has an MA in political science and a Master of Philosophy in law and governance. Then the fifth panelist will be Dr. Faisal Rahman, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Living Deltas Hub, that's the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at North Cumbria University in the UK. And he has previously worked with the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. He has also been involved in several programs, including adaptation technology, urban climate change resilience, and capacity development in the managing and allocation of natural resources. So Faisal is an environmental engineer by training, and he received his PhD from the University of Waterloo in Canada. Dr. Faisal has also summarized key principles about water as a leverage, and has made his discussion brief available on this Water Adaptation Community platform. And the Water Adaptation Community, of course, not only in this webinar, but even moving forward, will be keen to get comments and discussion on this living document, which is leading us up to the UN Water 2023 conference in New York. Now, first of all, to kickstart this panel discussion, like I did point out earlier, the purpose of this webinar is to increase understanding of how to put water at the center of adaptation. But not only that, but how to find a strategy that can enable us to transform the current approach to business as usual, and also increase investment, I think, like Joop did say. So to the panelists, I think the first question I think would be, how can we put water at the center of adaptation? I think Aditi did make a presentation on this, but what are the practical examples on how we can actually do this? Because this will actually help us in our programming for the water community. And then secondly, what should be a good strategy to transform the current approach? Still, this is for all the panelists to think about. Basically, these are the two major guiding questions. However, also, the panelists may choose to just respond to specific questions or to put together, responses that address multiple issues. From the audience, we also did have a number of questions, and I think there was a question from Sheila Mora from the Stockholm Environmental Institute. And the question was, how do we set up wastewater treatment in Africa as an adaptation action? I think Job extensively talked about sanitation being at the heart of this business. So I think what we want to hear from the panel is how do we put wastewater treatment in Africa as an adaptation action? I'll go through the first set of questions, and then we shall get, we shall open it up to the panel, and then later on, of course, as more questions come in, we shall be able to address them. Then Caroline Peterson, the question was, could Dr. Mukaji talk about IMI's work on managed aquifer recharge using diverted monsoon floodwaters as a simultaneous solution to drought and flood, especially research on effectiveness of different approaches in Uttar Pradesh? I think we really feel that this is one of the ways of using, nature-based solutions to actually address to enhance resilience. Caroline Peterson again, question is amazing work in Tamil Nadu. Congratulations. I didn't catch whose funding is this, the 221 million. I think it's a clarification. And the last question before I open it up to the panel is from Colin Heron. And the question is, here is an argument. Given, says, oh, sorry, there are more questions coming in. Here is an argument, given the water-related impacts of climate change and the potential trade-offs between climate change and mitigation, shouldn't a good implementation of integrated water resource management be the best adaptation strategy, which, by the way, involves implementing SDG 6.5. So at this moment in time, I think that's the first set of questions for our panelists. And like I said, we don't have to address them in any particular order, but I think it will be important to give us a perspective on how this can be done. So I would now like, I think, to start, I think, by inviting Aditi to provide us with a perspective on the questions raised. Over to you.
Thank you. I have provided some written answers to Caroline, particularly around the question of underground taming of floods. I think those kind of solutions are possible in particular kind of aquifer and climate that we have in the Ganges Basin, which is very deep aquifers and very high rainfall in the monsoon season. So those kind of, I think one interesting part about adaptation that has come up repeatedly in all the speakers' talk is how it has to be local. In the sense that what will work in this particular context of Uttar Pradesh will not necessarily work in, say, another context in Africa, or even for that matter in a hard rock aquifer in another part of India. I mean, solution in Uttar Pradesh will not be the solution in Chennai. So I think technically there are all these solutions possible, but we have to be very careful about the local part of it. The particular solution about underground taming of floods is something that farmers have been using. I mean, in parts where I come from both West Bengal and Bangladesh, farmers have been making very intensive use of groundwater just before the monsoon, the summer boro paddy. So they're making intensive use of groundwater, but in the process, they're basically creating a vacuum in the aquifer, which is alluvial aquifer. And then the monsoon rainfall is then, recharging that aquifer, which means that there is also one bit of extra production and rejected recharge, which was our earlier flowing as flood, is being prevented. So yes, there are solutions and we have to implement them and be very specific about what those solutions. And later, if I have some additional time, I also wanted to react to a bit of your comment around COVID and water, but I'll hold on and let other panelists come in. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for those responses. I would now like to welcome Henk Oving to provide us a perspective on the questions raised. How do you put water at the center of adaptation, and several other questions. Over to you, Henk.
Thanks, Emmanuel, and thanks also for the other presenters, and of course the questions that come in. As I try to explain is that, although perhaps not went into detail how tough it is to put actually water at the heart of climate action. We all know that water is impacting us hardest, and it's exacerbated by climate. And it's not only too much, but also too little. And the pollution of water, the quality of water, is hampered by climate change, and therefore impacting not only our infrastructure and our communities, small and big, most vulnerable first, but also our environment and our health. And that in the context of our current pandemic is only increasing our vulnerability with the most vulnerable first. So that means from the ground up, water climate action has to be dealt with first, but it also demands, I wouldn't say a top-down approach, but at least a prioritization from every level. Locally led climate adaptation action is not enough if it's not embedded in an environment that is cultural. So you could say informal, but also institutionally aimed at prioritizing water and climate action, climate adaptation action. It's not enough to have individual from the ground up amazing projects. They only then become isolated and are not developed into the alternative pipelines, programs, mainstream climate adaptation action. That is what we need. You need scale and replication next to these amazing opportunities. So it is a whole of a society, whole of government, whole of private sector approach that is of critical importance with this. So there's many opportunities for that. And I think we all showed some, but there are many more. But the challenge we currently face in the world, one of the challenges is that they don't add up when it comes to the investment. Right now, it's close to 1% of global investment in our economies in infrastructure are actually addressing SDGs and climate. And the rest is still making us more vulnerable in two ways: by increasing climate change. And we don't need to talk about that. We know that vulnerability, but also not only by increasing climate change, it's also by that those investments actually are put in the wrong place and destroying the environment that actually could help build resiliency, our nature, our natural assets, etc. So two sides of the same coin making us more vulnerable that have to be reversed. If we can turn that 1% into 2, 4, 16 and a majority, we are there. So that means scale, replication, and mainstreaming. That means that these bottom-up, community-led approaches that are indeed strengthening their environment, the society across every SDG, need that replication and scale and need to be embedded in an institutional environment that addresses and prioritizes water and climate action. So I stop here, but I think we all, of course, agree, but that it's not easy. So it's making sure that we juggle with community-led prioritization, politically prioritization, bringing together not only every sector and silo at the scale of the community, but also at the scale of the government at every level, from the ground up all the way to the multilateral system. And then I think this is also where next year's UN 2023 Water Conference can play a big role, because it is, for the first time in 46 years, showing that the world cares about water and prioritizing water at the global level. If we don't use that opportunity by matching both local and global, then we just lost it. But I think it's a good opportunity. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that perspective. Next, I give Job to give us his perspective on some of the questions raised by the panel. By the audience. Job, over to you.
Thank you very much. Before answering the question, I'd like to give a small example of how things are maybe working a bit better than we all think. When I was in Delhi the first time in 1992, Delhi had around 7 million people. And if you would read the newspaper, it was kind of staring into an abyss because of water shortage. The last time I was in Delhi, that was 2020 because of the COVID. I haven't been there back since. Delhi has around 30 million people and is still looking into an abyss of acute water shortage. But each and every year, the city has added a water supply for around 600,000 people. That's the size of the city of Rotterdam. It's not great water supply. It's not as healthy or as good or as sustainable or regular or as cheap as we all wish. But we need to recognize that a lot of things are working and sometimes at an amazing scale. On what needs to be done, I would very much echo what Henk said. We need high-level political awareness. When we organized at GCA a dialogue of African leaders, out of the 35 African leaders, prime ministers, presidents, 25 mentioned water-related issues as a key issue. We need to turn it around because they all mentioned water as a problem. We need to turn it around and make sure the next time they speak, they mention water as an opportunity. We need to learn more. I think Aditi brought it out, there are big gaps in our knowledge. And I think finally, what is really important, we need action on the ground as well, to learn, to show results. And we need to keep in mind, nothing succeeds like success, right? Political leaders like to be attached and involved in things that work, and that we need to show them that the water sector can be one of the sectors where I think actually work. I'll leave it there because I think I overshot the first time I talked. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joop, for that perspective. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Shilpi to give us a perspective on the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel, and thank you to all the speakers. I think I agree with whatever has been said, so I'm going to build on what has been said for now. I just wanted to respond to the question of how water is central to climate adaptation, and I feel at the local level, and as Aditi put out very forcefully in her presentation, it's already at the center of adaptation. You know, at the local level, a lot of action is happening, but as Henk and as Hoop have said, there are limitations to what local people can do. And I think the real structural challenge that we face is how to the question of scale. And we often think about scaling up and not scaling out. So that is one challenge. And the second is about integration. I think a lot of comments that I've been reading on the questions are about how to leverage coordination. This was also put out forcefully in the IPCC report, where they said that a big gap or a structural barrier is that institutions are not ready to respond to the challenges we are facing now and what we are going to face in future. So I do think that in order to leverage water, we also need to leverage collaboration and how to make collaboration work. And the question of scale is really important here. Not everything needs to be done at the same scale. So you need locally led adaptation, yes, because integration is already there at that scale. People have integrated water, food, and energy at that scale. Some are bearing maladaptive outcomes, which we need to reduce. But those linkages need to be understood at the policy level. And I think policies are still blind to it in many ways. Now, that could happen at the subnational level, because if we place all our emphasis on the higher levels, then there is a challenge of how higher levels translate into lower level or subnational level action. And there is all this tension between top down and bottom up. And I think we need to be very selective and very strategic about what scale can deliver what benefits and outcomes. I think I'll stop there for now, and I can come back to transformative action by giving some examples from recent projects that we've been working on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shilpi, for that perspective. Lastly, I would like to invite Dr. Faisal Rahman to give us a perspective on the discussions. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Emmanuel, and well, thanks to GCA for inviting me to be a part of this webinar, and I'm really delighted to be a part of this esteemed panel. I will mostly focus on the second part of your question, that, okay, how can we transform the current agenda? So as you know, that GCA commissioned this work, that, okay, how water can be put at the center for or at the heart of climate adaptation. when we started the work, we reached out to experts as well as looked at the literature, and accordingly, we have come up with certain principles. In particular, I'd really like to thank Henk as well as Joop and Asif, who has shaped the draft, which is available now, and it's as we mentioned, that it's a living document. So feel free to send your comments. Now, coming back to the point of transformation, when we say water as leverage, if we go back to the original leverage framework, leverage point framework, which was pitched by Donella Meadows, it said that, well, there are certain elements within a complex system with certain small push, you can achieve a much larger impact. And water, because its interconnectedness, actually can do that. And along the same veins, what we feel that the highest order of leverage can be achieved when you have a change in perspective or mindset. And what we argue in the draft is that there are certain ways you can achieve that transformation in the water sector, or putting water at the heart of climate adaptation. And the first of that, we argue, is that it's moving away from the perspective of water using as an extractive and segregated view of water. Rather, we argue that, well, it's water and water-related ecosystems should be valued as economic assets. And in fact, it has been argued the same way in 1992 in the Dublin Statement on Water and Sustainable Development. But if we can continue to sort of consider water, or change our perspective on water and ecosystem, consider that those as economic assets, that might help us to change our views. The second is along the lines is that then water must be embraced as a non-stationary asset associated with significant uncertainty. So climate change, if we look at, has introduced uncertainty within this system, and we need to embrace that, both water practitioners and policymakers. Now, the challenge in this regard is that because water is so perverse, often our understanding of how our daily activities or how the society is managed, sometimes we do not really, policymakers, or if you're not trained in particular in that, we don't understand the linkages. The biofuels is great examples that when climate mitigation, we talk about biofuels is coming up to the top front, but we do not recognize the impact on water and how that might impact other sustainable development goals. And that brings me to the third sort of transformation that we can highlight, is that when it comes to water or climate action, water is primarily discussed at the adaptation sectors, not so much in the mitigation. Aditi has already highlighted that, but there are many ways where we can see that, well, climate adaptation or climate mitigation, there's overlaps, and mitigation actions can achieve adaptation benefits, or done smartly, adaptation initiatives through water can achieve mitigation benefits as well. And the fourth element of transformation we argue is that justice and equity concern should be at the core of using water as a leverage for adaptation. And I think when Hank talked about those initiatives in Khulna, Chennai, this is what is about. They're considering that how can justice be put at the core of when you're putting water as a leverage concept into practice. Now, we must be aware of the fact that we talked about locally led adaptation, but we should not be naive to think that local is apolitical. There is a high level of power relations gap or political issues at the local level. And when we're talking about locally led adaptation, we cannot assume that that's a panacea. So we must be aware of thinking that, okay, locally led adaptation might not be the solution to every problems related or around water, but it should be recognized the fact that local communities need to have a voice much more than what they currently have. And the final thing that I would like to highlight is around innovation. We've talked about innovation, we've heard about innovation, but what we increasingly find out from the literature and from experts is that innovation should not really be considered as something really new. It should not be about like new things, about inventing new things or new engineering things. Rather, it's more about, we should embrace that innovation actually lies in combining a region or area's cultural, social, economical, and physical needs and opportunities into solutions that are partly physical, but also can drive policy change and policy reform. So I'd stop there. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I think for this elaborate feedback. I think your responses have attracted, several other, the bulk of several other requests, basically like for clarification and contribution. I'll just briefly run through another set of about 6 questions or suggestions, and then we shall be able to get back to you to provide feedback. Now, from Sadiki, I think he says what I would suggest is introduction of more sustainable water infrastructure and shifting from growing infrastructure to nature-based solutions. I think this is something that I think has been addressed by the panelists. And then he says recently the topic of nature-based solutions is in concentration, and some countries have already started practicing it, such as the Netherlands, Australia, and some others, and that he would be willing to share, further documentation on this. Secondly, he says some examples are using small scale, such as green roofs, permeable pavements, bioretentions, rainwater gardens, infiltration basins, and large-scale areas such as retention ponds, river widening, wetlands. And he says he has done his research on this at IHE Delft, and he would be willing to share his efforts. I think, thank you very much, Sadiki, for this insight on the practical solutions for adaptation, but also, harnessing into mitigation for benefits. The next question is from Manchu, and it says, are there significant impacts of climate on the water budget? And then he says, stakeholder participation in sustainable water resources management. Who are the most important stakeholders? So I think the questions that the person raises is, are there significant impacts of climate on the water budget? And secondly, who are the most important stakeholders in sustainable management? Then the second question is, how can adaptation be dynamically addressed? In the north of England, we have made catchment resilience changes, but find ourselves waiting for an incident to come along, a drought or flood. Only then can we know if our adaptation works. We end up with very long running trials that take decades to be formalized. So yeah, they've undertaken the precautionary principle and invested, but how do they ensure that their investment is right in addressing resilience? Then Aden, still the fourth question, he says, how can adaptations be dynamic? Yeah, I think this is repeated, yes. Then there's Laxman Sharma, and says a question to all the panelists. Maybe you'll try to answer some part of this question, but how do we convey with certainty the uncertainty of climate change? I think in most cases it has been conveyed as a cascading uncertainty. So without knowing in detail the impact of climate change in quantitative terms, how can we adapt for climate change? Do we adopt arbitrary design values in case we are trying to design the resilient water delivery system, say for irrigation, in determining a design value? It is still uncertain at the local scale what the rainfall intensities will be, and the design discharges to be used for infrastructure. Coming to the last set of questions, he says, here is an argument. I think this is from Colin Heron. Given that water-related impacts of climate change and the potential trade-offs between climate change adaptation and mitigation, shouldn't a good implementation of IWRM, or integrated water resources management, be the best adaptation strategy, which by the way involves implementation of SDG 6.5. And then lastly, in this set, I think taking time into consideration is from Yamini, says, on the point of embedding community-led responses in supporting cultures and systems, could you share examples of what works to do this? What led to shifts in government policy culture that enable such adaptation to happen? So this is the next round, I think, of questions that have been sent through. And I would just like probably the panelists, probably by show of hand, basically to just respond. There won't be any particular order, because in the interest of time, I think we're supposed to be closing at 9, but would like to provide as much of responses, to these questions. Still, many suggestions, even after this webinar, I think can be addressed to the DCA Secretariat and documentation shared as well. So I would like to invite Shilpi. I see no hand. Shilpi.
I think Aditi had raised her hand before me, so maybe Aditi should go first. Is that all right?
I didn't see it. I was navigating through Windows. Yeah. Okay. Aditi,
no worries. I'll keep it really brief, Shilpi. I was really reacting to Faisal's one around equity and justice. I think we haven't talked about that enough in our talk today. And that's where I also wanted to bring in the COVID example, which I think is a great example. COVID really did teach us that if there is political willingness, things move and things happen. But what also COVID showed us was this very unequal nature of the world and the very unjust nature of the world. The very fact that we have triple and 4 vaccinated, that people have been vaccinated 4 times in the global north, and we still have only 13% vaccination in overall in global south, and we have vaccines expiring. So I think that lesson of COVID is also extremely important for our adaptation lesson. It's not as if there is a lack of resources, but where is that political willingness, and whether we are putting equity and justice at the core of it, given that some of those who are facing climate impacts are the ones who haven't really emitted historically. So I just wanted to recenter that equity and justice part that Faisal was talking about as a pillar. I'll stop here. And some of the other answers, for sake of time, I have already replied in the Q&A chat box, and happy to engage more with the audience, later on. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that responsibility. Shilpi?
Thanks, Emmanuel. I just wanted to build on Aditi's point, because what I'm going to respond to is really the question on uncertainty and dynamic adaptation. And I wanted to bring in an example from the projects that we've been working on, and I'm involved centrally in it because, so we've been working in India and Bangladesh in climate hotspots, so in Northwest India and a dryland in Mumbai, which is coastal prone and flood prone, and in the Sundarbans Delta, both in India and Bangladesh. And there we've been working with local communities who are responding to this dynamic, to this local level uncertainty. So as we know that, there is a cascade of uncertainty, and science is complex at the local scale because of the cascading effects that uncertainty and climate change can produce across sectors. And that's why I think that this whole idea about equity and justice and locally led is really important, because if you don't center experiences of these very vulnerable communities, you will present outcomes, or you will come up with programs that will yield counterproductive results. So it's really important for these initiatives to be locally led if you want to respond to uncertainty, because the things that they demand or ask for are not always related to climate. They are livelihood centric. So we've been working with pastoral communities and trying to preserve an indigenous breed of swimming camels in northwest of India. And we have worked with them to develop this framework about how they see integration of biodiversity, climate change, and water in their lives, then how to build that model forward and scale it out. And responding to Yamini's question there, I think she asked, how do you have that change of culture and change in mindset? My response to that is, often we engage with local policymakers at the end of the project, that this is our outcome, this is what we've achieved, and you need to do something about it. I think we need to flip it, and we have to engage with local policymakers and all actors right in the beginning. It is just not co-creation with community. It is also this interface and dialogue that is required at that level when the project is introduced, so that the whole project can be co-developed with a series of stakeholders. And I think that helps with understanding the impacts of uncertainty, how it is perceived, and what are the relational consequences of it, especially in terms of justice and equity and gender equity, which is really, really important at this point, because it remains invisible. The whole care economy remains invisible. And often with adaptation and mitigation, what we are seeing is that it's the very vulnerable now who are bearing the burden of producing outcomes for those. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shilpi, for that contribution. Next, I invite Faisal to give us a perspective. Faisal, welcome.
Thank you. You've had his hand up. I don't know whether.
You go first, Faisal. It's okay.
Sure. Thank you.
I think you can go ahead and your program. Yeah.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I just want to highlight 2 points at the very end. And again, taking on from Aditi and Shilpi, I think that one of the things that we need to re-emphasize is that the first thing is that, well, this call for putting water at the heart of adaptation, or water as liberty, however we put it, it cannot be another way for us to sort of merely repackage development as usual. If we look at the Dublin statement for water and sustainable development, some of those are still valid, which looked at gender aspects, using water as economic resources, finite resources. But over the past 3 decades, what we see is that introduction of climate change, population growth, and other sort of socio-economical political changes demands that, okay, we need more things to be considered as principles of how we put water as the heart. Now, depending on which countries where we live in or context, there might be different approaches for governments to take, but there needs to be some certain principles that we have to follow. And that was one of the motivation for us to come up with certain principles, which we have highlighted in the brief. But as we said, that at the core is the justice equity, which Aditi highlighted in her commentary in Nature, is that, okay, broad brush solutions aren't going to be successful. And this is one of the questions that I see is that, okay, who's the most important stakeholders? I'd like to sort of revise that question, that it's more about who should adaptation be for. And it's always about those that are the most marginal. And that's the core principle for adaptation. And we cannot forget this. The second bit is more about the water sector. In any water discussion, that the elephant in the room is corruption. Sometimes ministries that are associated with water, these are the most corrupt ministries. And so that needs to be brought in the face as well, that, okay, there's probably considerable amount of funding that's going and it's not really utilized properly. And with community monitoring or community-led monitoring or top-down monitoring, whatever the ways are, we need to ensure that the funding reaches the local level as well as it's spent appropriately. So those are the 2 points that I would like to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that perspective. Over to you, Job.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll keep it really short. I fully support the importance of justice and of equity. There are ample examples of large-scale community-led development, right? You can think about the work that's being done in Bangladesh by many of the NGOs like BRAC, Grameen Bank, about the rural livelihoods programs in India that have reached hundreds of millions of women in particular, or for instance, the example of Mukuru in Nairobi. What they all have in common, at least what I think, is 3 things. One is it's about building social capital. It's about having a strong enabling environment. But what I learned is that we think in our space that it's all about climate adaptation. If you go to the communities, when I was working in the villages in Gujarat in '97, women already had to walk 4 hours a day to fetch water. And the men had to move away from their homes for 3-4 months a year because it didn't rain that year. And if they wouldn't move, the cattle would die. So I think for local communities, we really need to recognize that climate impacts are just a small part of their daily reality, and they are facing many other issues. And we need to be very aware of that. And we need to really address not just the climate adaptation issues, but the entire package, and make sure that we respond to whatever they need. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Job, and the rest of the panelists. I think we've run out of time. I think we're coming to the end of the webinar, so I'll just like to quickly wrap up, because many of the questions and more questions that have been raised can be channeled to the GCA Secretariat. I think we shall be willing to provide responses and continue this interaction. But basically, I think what is coming out is that to make adaptation work, we need to change the narrative. We need to stop talking about the water sector, and then, of course, talk about the water community. So as I mentioned earlier, I think this webinar is basically part of the global efforts in making water to be an important part of the global goal on adaptation. In addition, 17 organizations who are part of the Water Pavilion at the COP26 have sent a message to the UNFCCC with the same message, to include water as an important part of the global goal on adaptation. We hope you want to support this message and also help us as water professionals understand what we can do to help to mainstream water adaptation better than other sectors. This discussion, is just a start, but it will continue in the months to come, moving towards COP27, and we continuously welcome the input from this audience. We thank you for joining this seminar and to engaging with your comments and questions. I think it was very, very, very interactive. I think in the water and adaptation community, this discussion will continue, along with support collaboration, learning, and practical action for water adaptation and resilience. So the water and adaptation community welcomes your solutions to be able to broker that to solution seekers. And the focus is on governance, finance, and behavior change. As such, the WSC wants to increase the understanding of what adaptation means in practice and supports effort in adaptation mainstreaming. If you're registered on this online web portal, you can contribute to the online discussion and submit your own case studies, stories, articles, and videos. And for you who have been watching live, the video of this seminar will be available soon afterwards. So thank you very much, I think, to the Global Center for Adaptation. Thank you very much for the panelists. I think I can see a comment yeah, I think the comments keep coming in from the audience. I hope the GCA Secretariat, I think, can be able to provide responses to this. I think because it's a continued dialogue so that we can actually help to reach out to everyone as we build this global water adaptation community. So once again, I think thank you very much for your attention, and to the panelists, I think from wherever you are across the globe, to the participants, I think this has been very well, I think, attended, and I think we've been able to seize out some key directions that we need to focus on as we position water to be at the center of adaptation, but also, of course, to make water as a sector and as an enabler that benefits also, from the mitigation co-benefits. So thank you once again. I think we've just ended the webinar. I think 1 minute past the hour. I would like to thank you once again, and we look forward to future dialogue and continued discussion in order to enhance the water adaptation sector. Over to you, GCA Secretariat. Thank you. Oh, it seems you've signed out. Nitya, any final messages? GCA Secretariat, any final messages?
No, thank you. And that was a great webinar. Thank you so much, Emmanuel, and all the speakers from the GCA Secretariat. And we invite everyone to join the water adaptation communities and continue this discussion. Bye-bye.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.